Just 3 more episodes, including this one, until I present my scandalous Gumbo findings at the Intelligent Speech Conference 2022 on June 25th. But it's not just me. Take a quick listen.
Intelligent Speech is happening online on Saturday, June 25th, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Time, and consists of 4 simultaneous rooms presenting engaging talks, roundtable discussions, and rousing Q&As.
Trevor Cully from the History of Persia podcast.
Tegan Phillips of the History and Philosophy of Physics podcast.
And Gary Stevens from the History in the Bible podcast.
Sarah of the Rejects and Revolutionaries podcast.
Me and Christy, the host of Terranauts.
Jamie Jeffers from the British History podcast.
Tickets are available at intelligentspeechconference.com, and your ticket entitles you to both live attendance and access to all recordings after the fact if you cannot be there at the time or want to catch more of the amazing content happening simultaneously.
Ancient Persian propaganda in modern Iran.
Napoleonic-themed roundtable.
Solar spectroscopy.
Themistocles and the space program and the collective power of the big idea.
Tickets again are available at intelligentspeechconference.com, and we hope to see you there.
It would be so cool to Zoom meet you. So, links in the show description, tickets, website, all the important stuff. Check it out. Now, back to me. Episode 48, Salt, How to Make It in America. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the salt industry in British colonial North America, especially at the mistaken premises everyone arrived with, and what the consequences were to the plans for profits back in England, and how salt, while a bulk background substance, really did drive national policy and laid the ground for war. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that salt is bulky and heavy. So it is not in and of itself particularly valuable. But controlling salt, now that is where the money is. And the control of salt is going to be one of these issues, right up there with tax stamps, booze, and tea, that is going to convince people that the British have got to go. The salt control mania was such that one dude got a patent from the British government in 1641 so that he would have a 10-year exclusive on his awesome new process in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The total absence of the Samuel Winslow process as a leading technology in the early American landscape tells you just how successful that process was. In fact, in the 17th and 18th century, bulk salt was imported for the growing fish industry, along with almost all household salt. First from England and the Canary Islands, and then from the Caribbean. Moving salt around by ship was a way the British government was making money from their colonies. But the growing local industries wanted to keep more of their profits on their side of the Atlantic, so the hunt for ever more local salt was on. The earliest large-scale colonial salt manufacturers on the American side of the Atlantic were in the Caribbean. In fact, one of the first sightings of the Taino or Lucayo Caribbean people was of them harvesting salt on the island now known as St. Martin. Caribbean salt manufacture, as opposed to continental salt manufacture, made the most sense early on. Just about all seawater is around 3 to 3.5% salt. To evaporate water down to the point of making salt crystallize is a pretty heavy energy outlay. Therefore, solar farming of salt from seawater makes much more sense than using wood or later coal or gas fuels to do it. So if you have a climate that is pretty much sun all the time, like the west coast of France, the Canary Islands, or now the Caribbean, well, it's a great place to set up salt farms. Massachusetts Bay and even the future vacation land of Cape Cod were south of the latitudes of the salt pond regions of France, but our pesky North American weather patterns meant rain, too much rain, for good salt farms. So those 17th century New England dreams of salt farms were washed away. But those dinky islands next to the sugar islands that were too dry or too low-lying to grow giant grass or even coffee or indigo, they were good for drying salt. In fact, in the British and French orbit, as opposed to the Dutch and Spanish orbit, the Turks and Caicos group of islands contained a teeny-weeny, low-lying triangular island about 2 miles or 4 kilometers long and no more than 1.5 miles or 2.5 kilometers wide at its broad end. Then, as now, even before the creeping sea level rise, the island partially flooded twice a day with the arrival of high tides. As a result, only this smallest amount of terraforming was needed to turn part of the island into one giant salt pan. And that is exactly what happened in the late 17th and 18th centuries. The Turks and Caicos are some of the islands plundered by the Spanish in the 16th century for captives to turn into slaves on their different plantations. Before the end of the 16th century, most of these islands had been emptied of their tens of thousands of inhabitants. When the largely British colonists on Bermuda and the Bahamas went to check out these islands on their fishing trips, they found salt. Since the Dinky Triangle, soon to be known as Salt Cay, was completely uninhabited, it was a free space or a commons, that is, open for exploitation by any comer. Salt works, dikes, stone walls, trenches, ponds, and windmills were set up on Salt Cay, and the salt harvesting began. The exploitation of this particular island ended up with an atypical division of labor. The French and the English staked claims on this land alternately about 8 times over the 17th century, and each time it switched hands or when it was just raided because someone was bored or needed a bunch of salt, the people harvesting the salt would be taken captive by the side that had it now, along with barreling up the salt and putting it into their maritime stores. The white workers would be eventually released or ransomed, but any black workers, whether free or enslaved, would be treated as booty and become property of the winning side or the raiders. The white salt workers, merchants, and shipmasters, after a few rounds of this nonsense, decided they were sick of losing their property like that. As a result, for most of the 18th century, only white salt rakers would work Salt Cay. African and mixed race workers and slaves associated with the Turks and Caicos salt trade would work as the sailing support team, fishing and bringing provisions to the Cay and hauling barrels of salt back to the merchant houses on Bermuda and up in the Bahamas, or even all the way up to the coast of Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, Newport, or even Boston. In the Spanish and Dutch orbit, the island of Bonaire, near Curacao and Venezuela, was their main salt island. There were also smaller salt operations all over the Caribbean serving local needs, but Bonaire and Salt Cay were both exporting enormous amounts of salt, generally as bulk industrial salt, to the fishing industries on both sides of the Atlantic. Scooping solar salt up out of the Caribbean Sea using the support of the labor of enslaved people was so much cheaper than any production method back in Europe that it was being shipped to support the fish processing industries on both sides of the northern Atlantic: Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Maine, Massachusetts, New York, and Britain, Holland, France, Portugal, and Spain. The Mediterranean salt industry was still healthy enough that it didn't make sense to import Caribbean salt to southern Europe, North Africa, or the Levant, that sea curve at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. Well, that and the insanely cheap Red Sea salt that could simply be cut out of the ground. What all the Caribbean salt meant, money-wise, back in England, was that while sure they were able to collect some duties and such on the English-branded salt they were selling to the colonies and to some of their frenemies in Europe, the colonies were upending the established rules of colonies. As with the iron industry, Britain was trying to enforce the no making finished goods in the colonies rule for everything. No making finished cloth, no making paper, no printing books except for local consumption, and they really shouldn't be making finished food products for export. But the whole fish thing was making that a problem. New England sort of had to process the fish on the colonial shores. It's just the way fish work. And during the 18th century, the New England fishery, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Maine, and Massachusetts, was pouring over 10,000 tons of salted cod, dried or barreled, into Europe each year. Though there were some years where it might be more or less, depending on how this war or that war affected the supply of fishing vessels and crew. In addition, large amounts of the dried salt cod were also being shipped to the Caribbean sugar plantations. These were lower grade fish. In fact, over time, this became the more profitable product. Less care had to be taken with each fish, so lower skilled workers were used, and they were cheaper to pay. Not to mention the shorter, less risky trip compared to the transoceanic voyages to Europe. There was also the advantage of being able to deal directly with Caribbean buyers rather than working through the London merchant bottleneck that was required for colonial shippers selling in England. The salt and fish merchants were avoiding London at the hub of that 17th century rimless wheel. The iron and sugar industries had the government's ear. With their deep pockets and the owners of businesses living in and owning land in England, they were able to enforce the finishing of iron and sugar in England. Also, the nature of iron and sugar meant that their final refinement could be done at special finishing shops. Salt, on the other hand, isn't that complicated. You can be a small salt producer, unlike with sugar and iron, and most of the salt producers owned no land on the home island. So they had no access to or financial hold over the government in London. And when you get something for salt that is shippable, it's, well, salt. No more refinement needed or wanted. So the salt sent north up the coast and then the salt fish sent south down the coast was really cutting London out. First molasses and fish, now salt, ... What next? After all, lots of the poor in Britain were being fed on these salt fish imports. If a major source of protein for the home island was cut off, what could happen? This development of food economies and who knows what else that were just north-south with no necessary element of east-west were frankly making London nervous about these American colonies, which is part of the reason that the British were hip-checking the French colonists off of Acadia, and they renamed it Nova Scotia and inadvertently invented the Cajuns. The British needed a military outpost to keep an eye on just what these colonials were up to, and to make sure taxes were collected. Look, we have an empire to build. We need the tax receipts in addition to the profits from the raw materials. Heesh. Back in England, making white salt, rather than industrial salt, from underground brine seeps had been a mechanized industry in the early 18th century. The expansive shaft and pit mining that had been going on for centuries in the British countryside for lead and silver and tin had also made them aware of salt pockets under Britain as well. Mechanized pumps, both water and horse-powered, brought strong brine to the surface, and this 10+% salt brine was heated to make kitchen salt. The imported salt from the Caribbean was sandy and gritty and only fit for fish processing and other industrial uses. The good stuff you'd want to put in a salt cellar on the table and then make people sit above or below it based on their rank, that was the nice stuff, being made at the salt factories in places like Cheshire, Middlewich, and Norwich. The fancy equipment of huge flat pans, burners, and pumps were not being exported to the colonies. With all the wood out there, they would have been able to undercut the British white salt interests. But because there was this well-known salt industry in Britain, 18th century colonists who always had an eye out for the main chance were on the lookout for brine seeps, also known as salines. One of the first that was discovered and staked out in the North American colonies was on Lake Onondaga in the western part of New York, now Syracuse, which would become to be known as Salt City. Here the colonies had one of its first local table or white salt producers. This brine seep would also be used to produce coarse salt for inland and upriver use as well. The Hudson River, of course. Other 18th century colonists pushing out the edges of the early Virginia colony, searching for land not already gobbled up by the huge crown land grants from the 17th century, found themselves in what would be later carved off as West Virginia. The Appalachians, which are now known mostly for coal, were then known as a source of excellent water, plentiful timber, and salt springs. White salt manufacture for the fancy table was set up there as well. After all, there was no shortage of wood for both the boiling and the barrel making. That brine seeps or salines were usually located on top of rock salt deposits was not clearly understood at this point. So digging down and simply mining the salt was not considered an option. Rather, pumping up the brine for further refinement was the technique at work, and a tried and true one used across the world. And even if mining the salt as rocks was considered, at this point, the effort needed to build and maintain shafts was enormous. It was still all human elbow grease. The cutting of mine shafts was still using technology developed in antiquity. So what was being mined had to be much, much more valuable on a per-ton basis than salt, which meant wind, water, and horse-powered pumps, where everyone got to stay on the surface, were preferred, especially where there was already an established technology available. Okay, so here we are in the 18th century where there is a reasonable supply of salt. What is the 18th century cook using the salt to make? Last century, I mostly talked about how essential salt was to making and preserving different sorts of foods in the colonial kitchen. In the 18th century, this has not changed. If anything, salt has become more important because there were more people, there was more food, there were more fish to be exported. The next thing that happened in colonial food was harder cheeses. With scarce salt, it was hard to make any sort of cheese that lasted. It was all that soft farmer cheese. After all, in order to make it last into next week, not to mention across an ocean, a cheese had to get rid of a lot of moisture. So, a combination of a brine soak and then wiping it with brine solutions drew out water and made the inside of the cheese inhospitable to the sort of creepy crawlies that loved some milk proteins and loved some milk sugars. And so, while colonial cheeses were on the rise, as well as butter, the biggest evolution was actually happening in the meat department. Salt pickling and preservation were pretty good, pretty predictable, and pretty well understood at this point. But with more salt in more places, some preservation innovations happened, some of which are actually still with us even now. The colonials, with more salt and more sugar available, did create some hybrid preserves. They started creating salt and sugar containing pickles. But the real winner of the age was the adaptation of already extant technology of the indigenous locals on new food products. So, ham, cheese, and bacon skippers of the Southeast unite. Poiphilia casei, also known as the cheese fly, also named skippers because of the way their larvae leap into the air. These guys are a problem with preserved proteins, and in the 18th century, that meant some cheese, bacon, and hams. Incidentally, bacon in the 18th century referred to just about all fatty salt pork. Ham was often anything on the leaner side. Sure, butchers assigned these names to particular pig parts, but to the general public, ham and bacon were pretty interchangeable names. Anyway, back in merry old England, smoking was mainly used on fish or to dry the absolute living heck out of a chunk of meat, usually beef or venison, in the nook of a fireplace. There was little art to it, and as wood became more expensive and the preference for low-smoke charcoal rose, smoked meats became a food of the desperate, the poor, and the rustic. However, here in the colonies, where wood was not only plentiful, but blessed with the varieties that made tasty and fragrant smoke, oak, chestnut, and, oh boy, hickory, smoking returned to the front and center as a food preservation technique. I'll go into this much more during the wood episode, but the important part here is that frontier salting was not as durable and sophisticated as the better developed salting techniques back in Europe. Getting enough salt to keep the several pigs slaughtered at once might not be possible. But even worse, the mix of salts used back in the old country were simply not available, and incompletely or incorrectly salted pigs were in danger of an invasion of the ham skippers. But if the ham could be salted and smoked, maybe rubbed with some more salt and kept in the smokehouse, the cheese flies couldn't come in, and there would be no ham skippers. The Cherokee Nation and their Confederates and allies, back when they lived in their original lands in Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and all sorts of places no European had gotten around to tromping on, they were already great smokers of meat. And so when the pigs moved into town, they snapped up those irritating, destructive, vicious, yet delicious interlopers and subjected their entire back legs to the smoking treatment. The colonists adopted this approach, meaning that the original Virginia hams were actually Cherokee hams. So over time, Americans developed a preference for smoked and salted meats, rather than the European meats, which tended to be only salted and not smoked. The smoking was another way to get nitrates in the meat and keep the ham skippers from digging in and setting up shop. In Europe, where the chemical industry was better developed, it was pretty straightforward to get some saltpeter, that is, potassium nitrate, the other salt needed to complete the salting process. But on the colonial frontier, the number of apothecaries was, let's say, limited. Any saltpeter was likely already mixed into gunpowder. Wood smoke, especially from green wood, what was used for smoking foods anyways, because, when you burn it, it was smoky, contains nitric oxide. So while salt plus saltpeter back home kept the ham skippers out, in the colonies, it was salt plus smoke. So no cheese flies and no ham skippers. And when we get to the wood section, that is when I will talk about the invention of colonial barbecue. It happened in North America because lots of the necessary ingredients and skills came together. And one of those essential components was plentiful salt. In fact, barbecue does not happen without the plentiful table salt that was coming out of the brine seeps or salines of British North America. So that's where we get to with pre-revolutionary salt. The British are cranky about how salt going north and south is not paying off as richly as it should, and is producing some self-sufficient food and trade networks. That was not part of the plan. Meanwhile, the colonials see it that they are getting taxed for salt and other stuff, and are not seeing much return on those tax payments. So they are looking at developing their own salt industries. And they have entered the world of the hickory smoked ham. All of a sudden, the reasons to stay hooked up to the old country are looking a bit more tenuous. Salt, you're always causing problems. Next week, it's oyster time, when the colonists figure out that the Atlantic shelf from New York to the southern end of Chesapeake Bay is a giant oyster carpet. Well, some people might just have gotten a little greedy. Join me next week when I talk about that and some of the less glamorous shellfish as well. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A sincere thanks to those of you who have said nice things about the show in reviews. You're helping the world find me, and I'll be honest, it's so nice to know that people are finding something good in what I'm doing. And along with promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show description.